There's this myth about Toni Kroos that I personally find really, really annoying. There's this myth that Toni Kroos has really good ball retention just because he has a high passing accuracy rate. It's a really, really dumb narrative. And I'd like to discuss it a little bit. So I personally think that Toni Kroos' ball retention is pretty poor for a supposed playmaker. That's why he has to stay deep for the entire game. Because he doesn't have the ball retention to be able to navigate more advanced central spaces where he has to deal with more pressing. In the deeper zones of the pitch, where he's usually just standing in front of the two center backs, you don't have to deal with nearly the same level of defensive intensity as further up the pitch. But to highlight my argument, I'm going to go through an entire game. So, I'm going to look at one of Toni Kroos' individual performances, and I found a compilation of his performance against Leipzig in the second leg. So, here it is. So if we look at his passes in this particular game, the vast majority of passes are extremely simple passes where he is dealing with minimal defensive intensity. And most of these passes are completed deep inside his own half. And he's basically standing where the center backs are, maybe slightly further above. So these passes, which are like, I don't know, maybe 70-80% of the passes that he makes throughout a game, these are extremely simple passes. Like, literally, Harry Maguire would be able to make most of these passes. Like, just look at these passes. There is no way any sane individual can say that any level of ball retention is required for him to be making these passes. So, there's that. That's the vast majority of the passes. And then, there's the harder passes, right? So, you have the longer range passes. All of these passes here are pretty difficult in terms of passing accuracy. But that's got nothing to do with ball retention. I've always admitted that Toni Kroos has fantastic passing accuracy. He's got great vision, he's got great passing accuracy. Maybe it's up there with anyone in history. That's a discussion that I think is worth having. His passing accuracy and vision are amazing. But this, if you look at all these passes, there is minimal defensive intensity on it. This has nothing to do with ball retention. So this is already like 95% of the passes. So up to now, all the passes have either been extremely simple passes where he's facing close to zero defensive intensity, or longer range passes, which are much more demanding on passing accuracy, where he's still facing close to zero defensive intensity. And I've never denied the fact that his passing accuracy and vision are very, very good. So let's look at the few circumstances where he actually has to deal with defensive intensity. So before we look at these examples, I just want to lay some ground rules over what good ball retention is when you're dealing with defensive intensity. For me, good ball retention is when dealing with someone pressing you, you hold on to the ball for at least several seconds, and preferably you shake them off with a good dribbling move. That's good ball retention. If you're immediately passing the ball out, that's not good ball retention. Either that means that you know that you can't hold on to the ball for long, so you're quickly passing the ball out as soon as you can, or let's say the passer, he's not feeling that much pressure, right? He feels that he could do more with it, but he just feels like he doesn't need to. That still is an example of good ball retention, though. So let's look at the few cases in the game where he actually had to deal with defensive intensity. So in this first example, there's a defender who pressures him. But let's be honest, this is pretty minimal defensive intensity here. It's not even particularly dogged pressing, and he makes a fairly simple pass. Now this next example, I think is actually a good example of his poor ball retention. So here, there's only one defender putting any defensive intensity on him. And frankly speaking, it doesn't even look like a very committed press. And in this case, where you have a defender who's only just running at you from one side, it's not even multiple defenders. Someone with better ball retention likely would have held onto the ball and moved the ball forward. Because there's quite a bit of space in front now. You move the ball forward, you try to attract the defenders to you, and then you see if you can cause some trouble. But instead, Toni Kroos, he immediately passes the ball out. The fact that he's making a backwards pass, rather than holding onto the ball and trying to move the ball forward, is pretty telling in my opinion. It's almost as if he knows that his ball retention is not very good. As I said, he doesn't have the ability to hold onto the ball efficiently in advanced, congested areas. And in this case, the defensive intensity that he had to deal with was very minimal. And the next example, again, I think is actually a good example of Toni Kroos' poor ball retention. So in this case, you have a defender pressing him pretty doggedly, right? I'm not going to lie. Like the defender, this is a full-on press. But still, it's just a one-man press. And you're in a pretty deep area, right? It's not like you have multiple defenders coming at you. That's when it's tough, right? Because if you have defenders from multiple angles coming at you, that's when it's tough. You know that he's coming right in front of you. So if you had someone with good ball retention, like Verratti, they would be able to hold on to the ball relatively comfortably in this scenario. They'd be able to turn their body towards the left and be able to avoid the defender's press relatively efficiently. And it would make it much simpler for them to pass the ball back to the goalkeeper. But you look at Toni Kroos here. He doesn't have the agility to efficiently turn his body towards the left, which is why he is unable to deal with this defender's press. And he nearly loses the ball. In the end, the ball ends up very awkwardly going out of the goal line and he concedes a corner. And in this last example, there is a little bit of ball retention. But frankly speaking, it's extremely unimpressive ball retention. So at the start, he wins the ball back from an opposition player. So this is a decent defensive play here. And then, a defender tries to tackle him from behind. But the defender is, frankly speaking, quite a distance away from Kroos. And he knows that he's likely not going to catch up to Kroos. So he tries to slide tackle him. And Kroos kicks the ball in front of him and jumps over the defender's legs. This is really not particularly impressive ball retention. There wasn't any real actual defensive press here. So there have only been like roughly 4 or 5 instances where he actually dealt with actual defensive intensity in this entire game. And it's not looking good, right? There are 2 clear cases of poor ball retention. And another 2 cases where the defensive intensity was extremely limited. Now, of course, you might say, oh, you're being biased. It's just one game. You can look at all his other games. But this is exactly what most of his games are like, right? Don't tell me that Toni Kroos' games aren't like this. 90% of the time, he's operating in deep areas where he's dealing with close to minimal defensive press. This is a very accurate representation of most of his games. And even if I haven't convinced you that Toni Kroos' ball retention is pretty poor, at least I hope I've convinced you that passing percentages are an absolutely terrible way of gauging the ball retention of a player. You have to look at the context. Are they doing it in deep areas, or are they doing it in more advanced areas? Like someone like Xavi or Pirlo, when they have like 90-95% pass accuracy, for me that's more impressive, because they're usually operating in much more advanced areas of the pitch than Toni Kroos. And even if you look at Toni Kroos' body build, this guy is not suited for ball retention. He's 6 feet tall, or 183 cm tall. That's pretty darn tall for a midfielder. And on top of that, he has a very bulky build. This is a very unsuited body build for ball retention. Honestly, I'm just flabbergasted that so many fans think that this guy has good ball retention. And it's even crazier that they think that passing accuracy is a good gauge of ball retention. No, it's not. The fact that he has a high progressive pass accuracy rate is a slightly stronger argument, but it's still a very poor argument. As we saw in this video, a lot of his progressive passes were done under minimal defensive intensity. And the reason why he has a high pass accuracy is because he's very good range of passing. No one ever said that his pass accuracy is poor, right? His passing range and accuracy are very, very good. Up there with anyone in history. But that has nothing to do with ball retention. Toni Kroos' ball retention is very poor for a playmaker. And it's about time that fans realize this.